Ollie, obviously we work together, so I'm not really going to say thank you for joining me. But if we get started and you tell us a little bit about what we do at Orpheus, particularly for those that don't know what a CBEST is.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are at Orpheus, we are a threat intelligence provider, and we're using our heritage and understanding in threat intelligence. So we're effectively exploiting the fact that we understand the threat landscape to also power our cyber risk rating efforts. So we're coming at the problem of supply chain cyber risk or third party cyber risk, whatever you want to call it, from a slightly different perspective to some of the other companies that are in the market already. And of course, on top of those kind of two primary things, threat intelligence and cyber risk rating, we also do a lot of kind of additional bespoke subscription services, consultancy work, standalone piece of work, different bits and pieces.
And what about CBEST in particular? Can you explain a little bit about what you are?
Yeah, so just I guess a quick bit of background on that. So CBEST is the Bank of England's regulator-mandated intelligence-led security testing scheme, and I appreciate that's a bit of a mouthful, for the biggest banks and financial institutions in the UK. And a kind of really quick overview on that process. CBEST has been around since about 2015. It's since kind of spawned lots of similar intelligence-led security testing schemes in other sectors in the UK and internationally in other kind of global financial centres. The idea behind it was that companies, so big banks, financial institutions, were spending a lot of money on cybersecurity, an increasing amount of money. But they were still suffering breaches and compromises and losing money to cyber criminals. And the Bank of England and the regulators there wanted an approach that would obviously help the individual banks and financial institutions, but also really improve the resilience, the cyber resilience of the financial sector as a whole in the UK. Obviously, it's a critical part of any modern economy, but obviously as a kind of specialist sector for the UK, financial services were a particular priority for government regulation there. The idea is that in contrast to a more, I'd say maybe a less mature approach to pen testing, which would be compliance-based, so testing a particular application or service against a standard or a application focused test where you're only testing a kind of specific and limited part of the organization and only using a kind of restricted set of techniques. What you're instead doing is using an intelligence-led approach. So we, Orpheus, as the threat intelligence specialist in this context, we effectively work with pen testers, obviously the client financial institution, and the regulators to determine what is the most likely kind of course of an attack against a particular organization. So who's going to target them, what they're going to target in terms of particular informational system assets, what are often called key systems or important business services in the CBEST context, how they're going to do it, why they're going to do it, and then we work particularly with the pen testers to actually turn that into an actionable plan that they can go and test against that organization's infrastructure. That's the kind of basic outline of CBEST as a process. I think the core theme is taking an intelligence-led approach to security testing, so that you as an organization are able to get a better idea of the actual specific threats that you face, and that so that you can also get a better idea of how resilient you are to those particular types of attacks that you're likely to face. And obviously, when it comes to producing a remediation plan off the back of the exercise, you can understand where you fall short, where you're performing strongly, where you need to target additional resource for investment.
Now, in those scenarios that you've described there that we would come up with as part of our intelligence gathering, how have you seen the scenario shift to third-party risk? Has there been a big change in the last few years?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, the key thing here is that the work, the threat assessments and what are called the targeting reports, are also known as the digital footprinting report, that we're providing as part of these engagements. The idea is that they reflect the techniques, or even the TTPs, so the tactics, techniques and procedures that are being used by real world threat actors to target those financial institutions. So it's critical, and again, this is something at Orpheus that we've been talking about for a while. The increase in supply chain compromises as a vector, as an infection vector, particularly for nation states, but also recently cyber criminals, and I think that's been borne out in the ransomware compromise of Casare's VSA product is a classic example. And that's a long-winded way of saying supply chain compromise scenarios have increased massively in the last couple of years, to the extent where they're actually mandated by the regulator in some cases to ensure that as part of these engagements, a bank is testing effectively its susceptibility to a compromise affecting one of its key suppliers, or maybe one of the providers of its key software. So that if that third-party provider was compromised, or if perhaps their software updates produced by that third-party provider were Trojanized to provide a kind of access into the actual client's network, so that they can begin thinking about their preparedness to detect, to respond and remediate that incident. So they've become hugely more prominent in the last couple of years.
Now, banks tend to invest more in their security than any other industry, and tend to be a little bit further ahead than some other companies. Have you seen that with third-party risk, or do you think there's still quite a lot of work for them to do?
I think they are. I generally would say they're kind of further ahead. I mean, it's logical, as you say, that they effectively have been at the kind of sharpest edge of the threat, and we see, because of the the potential profitability of particular cyber criminal operations targeting the financial sector, that's invariably where some of the most capable groups are focused, and that's where they're trying some of their most kind of novel techniques effectively. I think certainly in some cases, I think some banks we've worked with have had really mature kind of processes set up in place to identify, monitor levels of risk associated with their third-party suppliers. In my experience, at least, I think a few of those programs have almost more kind of driven and operated purely from a kind of procurement and from a procurement focus, rather than being explicitly driven by the kind of cyber risk management component, or wherever that function sits within the organization. And there are kind of different requirements as a result. So obviously the nature of the process and the impact it has on your supplier selection is going to look quite different when it's driven by say a procurement department to when it's driven by effectively the GRC, or the kind of cyber risk or information security kind of wing within the business.
And what do you think we'll see next in third-party risk? Do you think we'll see more companies taking it more seriously, or do you think we'll see big changes in how companies monitor it?
I think there will be increasing, something we've seen already, and certainly something that we've kind of I guess had at the forefront of our minds at Orpheus is that shift between basically and I think there's a big difference between maybe what was the established model prior to maybe prior to a SolarWinds particular, or even going back a few years further than that, because I think a lot of companies, have been on a big kind of track to improvement with the way they've changed their approach to this in the last couple of years. I think previously with that, the previous model was around sending a questionnaire that was self-certified by a potential provider or third party at the start of the contract, or maybe once a year. It was a very static process. Questionnaires are filled out inconsistently. They're often a bit of it's effectively a questionnaire of, do you actually want to work with this company, in terms of how accurately you self-report. And I think the biggest shift we've seen over the last couple of years is towards a model that is, instead of that kind of static snapshot point in time, self-certified questionnaire, to a model that involves actual verification by data collection on those third parties. It involves looking from the threat actor's perspective, so understanding not only the vulnerabilities about how that third party organization looks, but whether they are particularly attractive to threat actors, so cyber criminals or even activists or nation states, based upon what they do, where they do it, how they do it, what their attack surface looks like. And I think the last and really critical thing is that, and hopefully something that we're going to see more of in the sector, and the way in which this problem's approached, is that there is a greater recognition that driving up kind of standards, cybersecurity standards in a supply chain is it's a benefit for everyone involved in that supply chain. It's absolutely not a zero-sum game. If larger companies, a company with thousands of smaller suppliers have the resources they can use to improve the security of some of those smaller companies by using a platform like ours, then it's a kind of net win for everyone in that supply chain. It's a win-win situation effectively. And I think that's been a shift in maybe the mentality and the approach that we've seen in maybe in the last year or so, especially, and a bit of a transition from a more competitive mindset that's maybe kind of dominated a bit more previously. But that's just my my perception on it.
And then last question is that we tend to talk a lot about what companies can do or should do, because that's the world that we're in. But what are threat actors doing? What do we see from them? Is this still a major vector for them, or are they looking at something else more seriously?
No, I think it is, a major vector. I think certainly in terms of I think we've only really scratched the surface in terms of the cyber criminal use of supply chain compromises specifically. So Kaseya, obviously the ransomware incident there was a prominent example, but it's not even the first time that we've seen an MSP targeted with a view to kind of pushing out ransomware to their individual clients. I think, again, looking at supply chain compromise, I don't want to say that generally we've been fortunate in terms of the cyber criminal choice of tactics to date. But for example, SolarWinds obviously was a nation state kind of perpetrated breach that had huge implications in terms of the confidentiality of information and the extent of the access and breadth of the access that the Russian state perpetrators of that incident were able to achieve. But it won't carry the same type of impact for SMEs that a more disruptive operation like a kind of mass ransomware infection can obtain. And similarly I think we've only seen kind of scratching the surface of what cyber criminals can do with Trojanized software updates. So interestingly, a lot of the time they've been geared around kind of less impactful, if that's a phrase, activities. So, for example, Trojanizing those software updates to mine cryptocurrency, rather than, for example, infect ransomware on third-party kind of individuals or companies. And I think there's in terms of the attack surface of potentially vulnerable software applications, the sheer variety of routes that cyber criminals have to as I say, target effectively those vulnerable web applications, weaponize those software updates and reach a extended audience. I think there's a real challenge there for the industry, and I think it's something we're going to hear a lot more about in the next couple of years.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much.
Cheers, Karla. Always a pleasure.